What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Levers Podcast. I am here with my fellow levered lads, Tej and Crisp, aka Lil Hack, as usual. And today we want to bring you an episode about steak, about red meat. And it might seem like a proof of steak, yeah. And it might seem like something kind of trivial, right? Like a, I don't know, oddly specific topic. But I think it's relevant. I hear a lot of my friends talk about red meat and the environment, or veganism, or beyond meat, whatever. And so, kind of for some background, I think in recent years, all three of us have began to kind of focus our diets around animal proteins, and uncovered some common nutrition myths along the way. And I think I can speak for all of us when we say it's like improved our health in one way or another, or improved our life overall. And so we want to kind of share some of our experience, and also aim to offer some opinions, kind of, or not opinions, but some facts to debunk some of these common arguments against consuming meat, whether it's ethical or environmental, something like that. So with that in mind, let's get her going. And I thought an interesting question to start off would be, what is each of your guys' favorite cut of meat, or like part of an animal, I guess, to eat? Like, what's your favorite like dish with red meat?
I'm gonna let Teach take that one.
I mean, a nice tomahawk, that about does it for me every time. I mean, I'm also a sucker for bacon. A tomahawk or bacon, that'll do.
Hell yeah.
I feel like I eat just like straight up ground beef every day.
I knew you were going to say that.
It's just the most
Chris is
reliable.
gonna be like, what's a cut?
So just
So minimal.
yeah.
I thought they just took the whole animal and put him through a shredder, and I eat meat plates.
I thought. Wait, you're saying there was a whole organism at one point?
I think I have to go with tomahawk too. But lately I've been eating more sirloin, and I've come to really like the sirloin as well. It's all good stuff.
Every time I try to go a little budget on the steak, I'm just like, if you're gonna eat steak 3 times a week, you can't be getting ribeyes and tomahawks and T-bones. Like, you got to get some of the shittier cuts. Maybe I'm just
You only eat steak 3 times a week?
Yeah.
Bro, how poor are you?
Extremely poor. I put all my cash into Safe Moon.
Yeah.
Hey, you guys. Wait, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole.
No, we're avoiding it.
I almost took the bait. So steak. So we kind of outlined a few of the concerns maybe that we've seen in the media, or just with friends or family. And I think 3 of the main ones, I'm sure we'll think of some more, or actually, let's start with the evolutionary side of things. Let's kind of lay out that side of it. And I think Tej would be good to kind of kick that off, because I thought you had an interesting take that I hadn't heard before.
Okay, so I think, and this comes up a few times in the history of the Levers podcast, but I think a simple way to evaluate whether behavior is sensible is to look at how long that behavior has been around, and to see if the genes that you inherited probably benefited or were harmed by a certain behavior. So I think it makes sense to look at our evolutionary past to give some color to whether or not it's proper to eat meat and how much meat to eat. So if you look at our evolutionary past, it's very obvious that we were hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of it, and pastoralism in agriculture is very, very new, basically an experiment. If you take all of human history and you plot it onto a 24-hour chart, we've been farming for 6 minutes. So we've been hunting for a very long time. You can kind of see it in our dental records. We still have canines and incisors, which are meant for meat. We invented fire a very, very, very long time ago, right? Fire effectively enabled us to outsource digestion to heat. So it allows us to cook meat and draw more nutrition from it. As soon as we started doing that, it maps pretty well onto when the size of our brains kind of exploded. So we've been eating meat for a very, very long time. If you compare, for example, the nitrogen levels in Paleolithic skeletons to the nitrogen levels of like pure carnivores, like canines, wild canines and hyenas, it actually looks like our ancestors had higher nitrogen levels, and that nitrogen level comes from eating meat. So to me, it's pretty clear that we've been eating meat for a very, very long time, and it's less clear how much or how little vegetable and grains we've been eating. But the fact of the matter is, humans have needed meat for a very, very long time, and we can get into this, but it's largely because hunting was a very economic activity. The fat in meat was energy. It allowed us to survive, and thus people wanted to go on big hunts to acquire that energy such that we could survive and reproduce. So I think the evidence is pretty strong that meat is deeply human. Eating and hunting meat is deeply human.
Yeah. So you're saying eat meat, get smarter, eat meat, big brain, something like that.
Eat meat, big brain. Big brain traders only.
And yeah,
Well,
I think we talked about it.
Well, the fire point was like once we created fire and we outsourced, digestion to the fire, we expend less energy on our stomach, and so more of it was freed up for our brain. So it wasn't just the meat part. It was like we created this technology, and then we could reuse energy elsewhere.
Yeah.
Which kind of
by
crazy.
the way, I maybe gave short shrift to the vegetables here, but fire was equally as helpful in extracting nutrients from vegetables, right? It was external digestion. So, animals with two stomachs, ruminants, they eat vegetables because they have the ability to ferment those. We don't have that ability. So raw vegetables are a little sketch for humans, but the fire does do the same thing effectively for vegetables. It breaks down the food so that we don't have to. And then that biomatter, as Chris was saying, can be sluiced to a bigger brain, which allows us to be a social species, build societies, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, meat caused society.
Meat is the root of all civilization. I agree.
I hope that our listeners are liking us breaking down cooking and the importance of fire, because now I don't need to go get a PhD in it because I'm so qualified. I think also when you're talking about kind of like hunting and like why we always hunted because we wanted the fat from animals, it kind of gets into this point about nutrients, which ultimately ends up being, I think, a big reason why eating meat is good for you. Is that one perspective is that like every calorie is fungible, so no matter where you get your calories from, all that matters is you get a certain number of calories. And then there's another school of thought where like different nutrients obviously affect your body differently, in which case getting energy from carbohydrates versus fats versus proteins affects your body differently. And so even as hunter-gatherers, even if you could get all your calories, just from local vegetables and different grains you could grow, there is an incentive to hunt bigger game, which is a more riskier endeavor because the fat from the animals is this nutrient that like our bodies craved. So for whatever reason, like we wanted to take these. Like you go into the risk of hunting a big animal because that's like inherently less likely to succeed than if you can just gather, local vegetables. But we're doing that because a calorie isn't a calorie isn't a calorie, and so I think part of the underlying philosophy of why people that get into become super advocates for meat is that they think that these nutrients that you can get from meat are different than what you could just get if you only eat vegetables and grains.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
It's kind of your guys' wheelhouse.
And I mean, the big game hunting, and we've only got an hour or so maybe we shouldn't go too far. But the big game hunting is super interesting because we tended towards big game hunting because despite it being super volatile, so you'd go out with a hunting band and one of 6 times you'd catch a woolly mammoth, you'd catch a wild pig. But despite that volatility, the net payoff in calories from fat which are basically survival calories, it's energy if you don't have access to grains or sugars, exceeded that from pure gathering or catching smaller game, right? Smaller game they're lean, twitchy animals. They don't have a lot of fat. That's not energy for us. And so we leaned into that volatility despite it being more uncertain. One final element, I'm reading Origins of Virtue right now, and Dawkins talks about the fact that hunter-gatherer tribes, they would get these big kills, right? 10 men would go out, they'd come back to the camp, and it wasn't just the man who caught the food in his family that got the meat. He would share the meat amongst the tribe, right? And that was reciprocity, because he realized that the next time he went out, he might not catch. Someone else would. They would catch the meat, and they would enter into the pool expecting reciprocity back, right? This is basically a very, very early financial contract. It was a hedge against the volatility of hunting.
It's beautiful. And something I add to, like we talked about it in the fasting episode about kind of the heuristic of evolution and just a simple rule to apply to mainly health, but I think a lot of other things. But when you think about, where your ancestors were from, like me, like I have kind of Nordic ancestry, and a lot of them were in very, very cold environments most of the year. And so they still had to eat just as much, probably more than I have to eat, right? Like they were moving around a lot more. and you just think about what's available for them, and what are they gonna focus on trying to get, right? So if you're out in a cold environment, are you gonna like spend all your time trying to find, I don't even know what berries grow during winter, but like maybe blueberries or something. But it's like, are you going to spend your time trying to find like blueberries, or are you going to like spend, almost every waking hour trying to hunt an animal that you could live off of for weeks? And the answer is pretty obvious, right? Because like I don't know.
The geographic ancestral framework, I think, is interesting and transitions us nicely to debunking meat myths. So like, to your point, you had Nordic ancestry, right? So you can think through, to some extent, I mean, we all ultimately originated in the south of Africa, right? So these arguments need to kind of be qualified. But in the Nordics, right, you don't have access to a lot of equatorial fruit or a diverse range of vegetables. It's primarily large game. That's what your ancestors would have eaten. And so if you extend that to the extremes, like there have been ample studies done on the Inuits, right, who live deep, deep in the north where jack shit grows. And all they eat all day is meat, seal meat, fish, whatever animals they could find. Their diets were like 99% animal flesh. And their rates of coronary heart disease and cancer are trivially low, right? And that's one of the key barbs that the anti-carnivore community throws at meat. Well, if you eat too much meat, then your cholesterol, specifically your LDL, will be high, and that causes coronary heart disease and cancer. I mean, I think it's like fairly difficult to say that in the context of Inuits, who literally don't eat anything but meat, but whose levels of morbidity from cancer and coronary heart disease are way, way, way below Western nations.
Dude, I heard that the Inuits were somehow like just hunting
Yeah, they
whales.
cranked whales with harpoons.
So maybe it's not actually a fair comparison, us to them. Like maybe if I eat a bunch of meat, I will get a bunch of heart disease because I am nowhere near capable of hunting whales. So I don't know. I don't know if that argument completely aligns. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, and the idea that there's like a absolute perfect diet is kind of, it almost doesn't exist. I mean, like in my opinion, like eating a carnivorous or mainly carnivorous diet is like close to perfect, but I think at a certain point, like there's a give and take with whatever you do, right? So it's like it's not like eating red meat, you're going to live 200 years and have a 10-inch cock, um, but yeah, I think it's just, I think like I've heard, I've, because I used to be really into the carnivore stuff, and I watched a lot of debates between like nutritionists about it, and they get so down into the weeds where it's like, okay, like what are we even really arguing here? Like over like a 2% chance of colon cancer or something, it just kind of becomes stupid.
Right.
But I,
I mean, I think like, well, any of this stuff is, as you do research, like none of us are smart enough to know like what really caused evolution, and how all these chemical reactions going in our body are playing out, and all these different arguments for what's good and what's bad for you. It's like you got to mix these kind of like logical arguments with like how things intuitively make you feel, right? And so you should try like eating more meat or less meat, and like see how it makes you feel, and then how that lines up your intuition, your body telling you how it feels with like these different arguments. Like I don't think just on the face of them like these meats arguments are just like so compelling. So then if I ate meat and it made me sick every day, I was like, I got to keep eating meat.
right, right.
I think part of the reason why like my diet centers around meat is because if I'm eating lean meat and not eating a bunch of sugar and carbs, like I feel like I have a lot of
Yeah.
energy and I feel good. And so then, in conjunction with like these other arguments, then I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense to me,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of like you take an ensemble of kind of models, one being logic, one being evolution, you know, and then one just being like your emotions and your energy, your personal energy, and then you arrive at a conclusion.
On that note, of listening intuitively to your body, the vast majority of vegetarians and vegans are women, and I don't think that is at all coincidence. Like if you look at the sexual specialization of labor, like the men hunted meat and the women gathered tubers and berries, right? And so I think it's very likely that women's bodies simply don't react as well to animal flesh as ours do. And then extend that point to kind of what Shake was saying, like the point of this podcast is not to give you a rule about a carnivore diet that you must follow ruthlessly. It's to give you a framework that should fit into a basket of frameworks to live the most complete life you can. So if buying grass-fed beef 6 times a week is untenable, and your inability to engage socially with other people because they're eating grains and drinking alcohol is prohibitive, like that doesn't really make sense. The idea is just to extol the virtues of a meat-based diet so that you might integrate it into your life in a way that makes sense. If you feel good eating certain foods, then those certain foods are probably pretty good for you. I mean, I think we all know deep down, that's maybe sort of a shallow thing to say, because in the short term, if you eat, a whole bunch of candy, you're going to feel amazing. But over the long term that it's sapping your energy levels. You can feel that intuitively. Whether or not you identify it and lean into it, understand it, is a different question. But yeah, the idea is not to force you into a stringent routine. It's just to inform you about the benefits of certain behaviors and try to debunk some of the some of the sort of lazy science and FUD around the anti-meat camp.
There's a lot of FUD. Yeah. And so one of the first things that we were brainstorming prior to hopping on here was the energy inefficiency of eating meat. So in terms of, as a human, you burn a certain amount of calories a day. A calorie is a unit of measurement, and so you need to eat a certain amount of these units of measurement to live, right? And kind of like Chris said, I think you said that like a calorie is not a calorie. The way I look at it, like a calorie is a calorie, but it's almost like what just macronutrient is not a macronutrient, and a micronutrient is not a micronutrient. So if I ate like a whole loaf of white bread, let's say, and it's 2,000 calories, or if I ate, 2 filet mignons, it's 2,000 calories, right? Like, yes, it's the same amount of calories, but the way that my body reacts to it is going to be massively different. And really, in my opinion, carbs and fat are energy, whereas like the calories from protein, it's really inefficient for your body to use them as energy. And protein is essential for maintaining and building everything in your body. And so people, I saw it was actually Bill Gates. He was on this guy's YouTube channel talking about, like, he's a big investor in Beyond Meat or something like that. And they were talking about, it takes this much water to like make a beef patty, and it takes this much water to make like a peanut butter sandwich, and they have the same amount of protein. And I've actually heard people use that same argument before. And in reality, like, if you got all your protein, let's say someone like me, like I need about 200 grams of protein. If I got 200 grams of protein a day from peanut butter, it wouldn't work, because peanut butter is not a complete protein. And by complete, it doesn't have the essential amino acids. So I don't know how many there are. TJ probably knows, but is it 11? Yeah. And certain amino acids, when they call them essential, it's because your body can't synthesize them on its own. So you have to get them from nutrition. And red meat specifically has a complete amino acid profile. So if you eat red meat, you don't have to supplement with anything. You don't have to think about, hey, do I need to take like BCAAs or some bullshit like that? Or do I need to take a vitamin? It has it all there. Whereas if you're eating, like, actually vegans, let's say, they have to be very careful to supplement all these extra amino acids, as well as other vitamins that we'll get into. But and if they don't, they don't perform optimally. Like, they're not in optimal human physical condition. So the energy inefficiency is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a foolish argument, because
the energy inefficiency thing comes from the fact that if you take the assumption that all that matters is the number of calories you get,
right,
then the most energy efficiency, meaning like you could eat grains and vegetables, which then cuts out this layer in the food chain. Like, you don't need cattle eating like grass, and then you eat the cattle, and so there's this whole like part of the food chain you can cut out, and you can still get the same calories. But if you question the claim that all that matters is calories in, and that it's not like it is a unit of measure. Every calorie has the same scientific like properties, but that's not the unit of measure that matters the most. Like you're saying, it's actually nutrients. And it's actually kind of interestingly ties into like the fire, like point how we outsourced metabolic characteristics to fire. We also, not like intentionally, but through evolution, outsourced metabolic processes to animals, right? So we became dependent on eating these amino acids, and part of the reason we could do that is because we could get those amino acids from cattle, and cattle's metabolic systems are better, finely tuned to actually digest, grass into the amino acids we need. So, I mean, that's kind of like how food chains work, right? Like, someone at the top of the food chain can't just skip levels because, the calories are fine at a lower level. It's like they've become dependent on the intermediate layers. And the whole calorie argument doesn't really explain why that matters, right? I mean, if you dig into it, the whole like calories is the most important measure. It's just so reductive. And so I wouldn't take them too seriously, I guess.
All very, very good points. Well put, both lads. I think the protein not as energy, but critical, is a really important point. We can transform protein into glucose and use it as energy. It's basically step 3 of energy creation on kind of the fasting scale as you get deeper into fasting before ketosis. It's called gluconeogenesis. The problem with gluconeogenesis is it's a desperation play by the body, and it's not meant to be done full time. So if you're on a carnivorous diet, and you have too much protein relative to fat, your body is constantly in gluconeogenesis, which is an absolute drain on your energy. So you need to make sure if you're going to take on a carnivore diet that you're getting in those fats. That's your energy source. That's clean premium fuel, especially compared to glucose, which is, unleaded, rancid, standard fuel. Another point to add to this, to the full amino acid profile, which is critical, and something vegans just miss, the ones that are not just ruthlessly supplementing, you just miss that. You're missing EAAs and you're missing B12, which is a place we can go. But another great thing about the steak is, so amino acids are they're the building blocks of life, right? DNA carries the instructions to create amino acids, which create us. Steak particularly, it's bioavailability, which is to say the percentage of the nutrition in the steak that we can synthesize and directly use is really, really high. I think the only sources that are higher are whey protein isolate, which is an isolate, which has its various own side effects, and eggs, and eggs should absolutely be part of a carnivorous diet as well, for the purposes of vitamin A, calcium, fat, good cholesterol. But you eat a steak and you can use basically everything in that steak to transform into useful tissue. Whereas sort of like what Chris was saying is you can't just blast all the way down to the food chain and eat raw flora, because we don't have the facilities to transform that flora into anything useful. So like the bioavailability, I don't know the numbers, on various uncooked grasses and leaves is really, really low. So while it might have the same caloric value or the caloric quantity, that's not really what we should be looking at. We should be looking at the efficiency of taking down the nutrients in the various foods. Even like, so to get to the Beyond Burger, right? This is posited at or presented as a reasonable alternative because it has similar protein levels as meats. And that's true, right? But if you look at Beyond or Impossible, it's pea protein, it's soy protein, which outside of like even the estrogenic effects for men, like those are not super bioavailable forms of protein. On top of that, with the Beyond and the Impossible burgers, they're just, the ingredients list on these things are absolutely out of control. They're loaded with vegetable oils. Meat is just meat. It's just amino acids. It's clean, bioavailable, full amino acid profile fuel. And I think that's not to be understated. Also, just getting back to the evolutionary argument, we've been eating this very refined form of protein for millions and millions of years. Fast forward to today, I think the biggest, most potent argument against eating meat is, or looks at specifically how our modern meat is cultivated. I think that's the most valid argument against meat by far. Look at the industry incentives and the feed that goes into meat and the quality of the conditions that our animals live in. That's where the juice is. That's what people should be focusing on, and we need real work to iron out kind of that pathology in the meat supply chain. But villainizing meat as bad in a vacuum really, really holds very little water to me.
It's a really good point. It's not the meat itself; it's the kind of bastardized process that the modern food, industry. That's the problem.
I think that gets into another one of the, criticisms of meat is like the effect on the environment.
Yeah.
Which you guys had some interesting points on. But it's kind of like relates to this whole supply chain of how we're getting our food. And I think part of the argument against meat is just like its, CO2 footprint, right?
Yeah.
And you guys had some good points about that.
So I think for the CO2 footprint, the first thing that's brought up, which is just so elementary, is the methane emissions from the animals. But I think as Shake said earlier, the methane emissions are relatively trivial. They exist, that they're there. I think they're comparable to the methane emissions of humans, to be honest. But even that is sort of a drop in the bucket in the scheme of net emissions by agriculture compared to the transportation costs and the emissions from the technology and the supply chain. And the thing is, if you run the simulation, that is, all U.S. men and women are forced off meat and they're forced to eat grain and vegetables only. It's not like you have a reduction in transportation cost or a reduction in the emissions from the various technologies that underpin that supply chain. So I think that's sort of a starting point. It's just sort of a very shallow look into emissions. On top of that, I think at a deeper level, if you look at kind of what American farmers are now optimizing for, we've, as usual, taken sort of human arrogance and tried to modify a natural system. So now what farmers optimize for is they optimize for yield. They optimize for calories so that we can feed people cheaply. And granted, that's been really important to a lot of developing nations, right? You're driving down the cost of production for food, which makes it more affordable, which means people can live their lives. But these plots of land, they're being optimized for yield. And a variety of crop that is high yielding and protected against the volatility of the environment is not necessarily high nutrition. We're optimizing for survivability and yield in a way from nutrition. And basically what that does is it encourages monocropping. One crop on a single plot of land, fertilizing it into oblivion, getting yields at the end of every 6 months to ensure that your farm is solvent and you're paying off your mortgages. But that strips the soil of nutrients. It strips the soil of what gives those crops nutrients, and that feedback loop goes on ad nauseum. Rewinding back to why animals in a vacuum are not necessarily carbon inefficient, if you have a sort of a regenerative mixing of animals and plants, animals will eat plants on land. They'll eat various grasses or plants that are living on land. They'll fertilize those same grasses, making them richer and more nutritious. And we can eat those animals, but those animals over their lifetime will have given birth to many more animals which regenerate that land. So instead of just looking at meat and the transportation cost and the methane emissions of being so negative, if we could reintroduce incentives into modern agriculture, whereby you have this very natural mixing and building of an ecosystem over a long term, and we only take out of it an amount that doesn't undermine the longevity of the system, that's a very different conversation. Like, that's where I think the discussion and the criticisms and the productivity can come from, not just these very surface level arguments about animals farting.
Yeah. And, I looked it up, and if you go to EPA.gov, it breaks down our greenhouse gas emissions as a country for the past 20 years, I think it is. And methane specifically is 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and of methane, it's about 27% is agriculture. So it's literally 0.02% of all the greenhouse gas emissions. So by far, driving a car, flying in planes, that actually makes a difference. But if you were to have everybody in the U.S. stop eating meat all of a sudden, you wouldn't even be able to measure the difference. And as TJ said, the regenerative agriculture is actually an important part to kind of reversing some of the greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't know. Again, it's kind of a lazy counter argument, and it's just it takes 10 minutes to look into it yourself, and you see that it's bullshit. And actually, this brings up a good point. I have my own kind of, tinfoil hat theories about why it's out in the vernacular. Why is it part of our culture to do these fucking meatless Mondays and, act like veganism is the greatest altruistic act? What do you guys think? Why is there this this narrative that eating meat is bad?
I think it. I think actually a not horrible argument is animal welfare. I think that's pretty key to the vegan narrative, which is that it's arrogantly and uniquely human to think you just take other lives for your own purposes. But I think that if you look at it in terms of like a broader like net welfare scope, there's a way to do it, and we've been doing it for millions of years, such that the elimination or the eating of animals is relatively humane, and so you can do it in a way that regenerates the ecosystems of animal and plant life, while also ensuring that we're feeding ourselves with the fuel that is most healthy for us. Like, for example, there are a lot of like halal practice, for example. The sort of underpinnings are to kill animals in a very humane way and to pay tribute to the sacrifices that they are making. So I think the animal welfare component is a pretty big part for the vegan narrative.
Because I think I hear more about these other arguments than I do about the animal welfare. Because I agree, the animal welfare argument is actually probably the best counter argument to eating meat. And the way I look at, I mean, again, this is kind of about the way that we raise livestock. It is like extremely inhumane, and it's not at all similar to like how animals have lived for thousands of years. So I actually think it's probably like, I think it's, for me, I think it's the best counter argument. But I don't hear about that argument as much as I hear about the energy inefficiency, the environmental concerns. Oh, it causes cancer. Those are the ones that I hear from people more so than I hear like, oh, it's mean to harm animals. Do you guys agree, or do you guys think like if like not even like a vegan argument, because like vegans use that argument, the welfare argument, but just like a general person. Like I have a couple friends who aren't vegan, but they like don't eat red meat because they think it's bad for one of these reasons or all of these other three reasons.
I think I might be also biased in terms of like my sample set for vegans. My sister is vegan, and she's pretty diligent about it. And so I think it makes sense that her most important sort of fundamental is the animal welfare argument. So I think we sort of discussed the emissions one being a bit spurious. I think the cancer and coronary heart disease we got into also. I think another key there is for these, I mean, we hope they're interventional, but for at least the observational studies where there's been some correlation between red meat and these sort of pathologies, these morbidities, is there's a lot of confounding variables typically in those evaluations. So, for example, at least in kind of the current climate, those that continue to eat meat have sort of a like rebellious streak to them, right? They're not part of kind of liberal progressive circles. They maybe live in poorer areas. They're maybe more pro-freedom, pro-gun. I don't know. There's a billion connections in there. I think you guys kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to say. But a lot of those people also have a variety of other habits that can confound this study, right? Like a lot of the times there's cigarettes involved, low exercise, high diets in sugar and vegetable oils. There was a study in China that showed that eating red meats, a high proportion of red meats in your diet, showed lower signs of coronary heart disease and cancer. You look at the Inuits, the evidence is largely the same. And there's also kind of the cholesterol argument that eating red meats raises your low density lipoproteins, which is seen as like bad cholesterol. When in reality, it's more likely that that rise in LDL comes from excessive carbohydrate intake, based on my research. And in the scheme of heart disease, the focus has always been on bad cholesterol. But occurs to me, based on what I've read, it's not high incidence of bad cholesterol that causes heart disease, but low incidence of good cholesterol, very high density lipoproteins or high density lipoproteins. And those HDL and VHDL, think VHDL, those come primarily, or they come in ample supply from red meats. So I think I encourage people that are worried about the age-old cholesterol argument to read a little bit into the history there of Ansel Keys and the lipid studies, and the Ansel Keys is such a narc, and the China study, and you'll see that a lot of this stuff is either just blatantly wrong, confusing causation with correlation, or the funding comes from those that benefit from pushing you away, and not even away from meats, but towards alternative forms of nutrition. There's always a lot of money to be made, so just, do your own research.
Yeah. Yeah. You kind of have to look at like who stands to benefit. So, for example, actually, this is something good to bring up. What's that movie called? Game Changers, right? The vegan movie.
Yeah.
It's this one. This triggers me a little bit, if I'm being honest. I think that
This is a safe space. Can we not talk about
this is a safe space. Never mind.
Keep the game the same, please.
Yeah, the game doesn't. Yeah, but that and I watched it because I was hearing about it so much, and at the time I was like really, I had just started doing carnivore, and I think that movie is one of the reasons, I guess, is what I'm saying, that a lot of people last year were thinking about eating meat or not eating meat specifically, but that movie, right? It was produced by, I want to say it's Michael Bay. I should have fact checked myself. Whoever produced it has like hundreds of millions invested in a plant-based meat company, and it's, again, like, you just Google this, it's pretty easy to find it, and you can go and you can break down the arguments they make in that movie, but it's just like, if you look at that, you don't really need to. So it's just kind of like a quick way to look at things, like who stands to benefit from making a claim, right? What benefit do we stand to make the claim that red meat is actually good for you? Like, none of us sell beef jerky, right?
Yeah.
So
Dude, it's funny in Game Changers, like, you made this joke, like, oh, if you eat meat, you'll have a tendon to cock. Like, in Game Changers, they literally say that if you eat meat, you'll have stronger boners. And I was like, but they didn't do it as a joke. They were dead ass serious.
Wait, they said if you don't eat meat, or if you do
I was like,
eat meat?
if you don't eat meat, you'll have stronger boners.
And dude,
Like,
it's funny you say that.
And they had someone in a lab coat,
Dude,
measuring people's
so
erections in the middle of the night.
It's so funny.
And people are like, oh, yeah,
dude, because so TJ brought up I totally forgot about that part, but TJ brought up the cholesterol argument, and like people when they hear cholesterol, at least when I first started learning about it, it's like, oh, cholesterol's bad, right? And at like a microscopic level, cholesterol is the precursor for testosterone. Like, you need cholesterol to produce testosterone, and there's like I don't know, I don't have any stats to back this up, but there's a lot of people, as they get older in age, they have difficulties with testosterone and therefore erections, right? And holding on to muscle mass, and energy. Like, testosterone for men has like so many effects. If you have low testosterone, it like completely screws you up. You get depressed, you can't sleep as well, whatever. And I'm not saying that eating red meat increases your testosterone, but it's like, it's at least part of the puzzle, and not eating meat at all definitely is, I can't say definitely is going to decrease your testosterone, but it's not going to help it. Like, it's like the idea that like not eating red meat is like better for your testosterone is just ridiculous. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, cholesterol is like when I grew up, maybe before I was 15, the idea in my head is that cholesterol is like this foreign toxin that needs to be kept out of the body. When cholesterol is integral to cell function. It shuttles nutrients through the bloodstream, right? Cholesterol are these little carriers of nutrients that are small enough to slither in and out of cells and deliver them with stuff that they need, right? And so we've seen, we look at these cases of heart disease, specifically coronary heart disease, and you see like this atherosclerotic plaque, right? And it's made up of cholesterol. And so the takeaway was simply, ooh, cholesterol was found at the site of the murder, and thus it is the committer of this murder. When in reality, that was low density lipoproteins that had just agglomerated there because of other metabolic issues, right? It's not, cholesterol isn't this bad thing. It's endogenous to the human body. And so the kind of mindless vilification of all cholesterol as directly contributing to morbidity is it's just weak. It's just shallow.
I think something that's interesting is that, yeah, part of the distaste for meat, I think, comes from this, like, kind of the image of where the meat's coming from is very unnatural. But like, as you kind of pointed out, that's how kind of the whole supply chain of food works. So even if you're eating, you're eating all grains and you're like, I'm not eating meat, I'm being really good for the environment. Like the monocropping, it's like we're doing the same thing to, the soil that we're doing to these animals, where we're just like abusing them in the sense of like, we kind of abstracted the supply chain to only be about efficiency. And so I think that kind of weakens the argument against meat, because you're kind of doing the same thing, even if you're, not eating meat. And so that kind of gets into an interesting kind of dilemma where, these supply chains have produced way more food, let a lot more people live, right? So there's more humans running around the planet. And if we move away from that, that's less human lives, right? We can't support as many people. And like, how do we make that trade-off, right? Because I know a lot of people are big on this, like, move to more local farming. But obviously, maybe not obviously, but if you move to more local farming, there's, like, you got to think the earth is going to be carrying less people, right? So like, how do you, I guess, I don't have an answer to this, but do you guys ever think about that? It's like, if we move towards more localism in our food production, there's going to be less people living. Like, do we want that? Do we not want that?
I mean, I think that's a measured point. I mean, like I was saying,
that's a 10-inch point. 12 inches, maybe. Sorry.
In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, like the monocropping and the industrialization of grain production, it definitely, like, it bolstered whole nations. Like it brought China and India and a lot of Southeast Asia, like, out of poverty. So there's definitely something to be said there. I guess looking forward, I think there is a balance to be struck, because despite the carrying capacity of the earth going up as we encourage monocropping and the industrialization of particularly grain production, the quality of nutrition goes down. So, the quality of life per individual, I think, goes down a bit, which is a tough and sort of humanless argument to make. But as we go forward, I think if there's some way that we can encourage the regenerative approach, I think you can more and more so capture kind of the best of both worlds. As we've seen, like, technology doesn't stop. And so I think technology will end up being a part of regenerative agriculture to an extent. I mean, I don't think that they're fundamentally at odds, and it will make regenerative agriculture more and more affordable for more and more people. So I think that kind of needs to be the approach going forward. I do realize, though, that it's an extremely privileged thing to say. and to say, let's cut grain production because it's stripping the soil, it doesn't, it gives short shrift to the idea that you're literally killing people. So I think it's a tough argument, but I think there's a middle ground to be struck for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this can like come from the top and then someone's gonna be like, all right, we're going back to localism, or we're not. I think each person needs to make their decision, and probably the best thing to do is, if you're very against the environmental impact of your food, is just to eat as locally as possible. Um, that meaning, your veggies and your meats or whatever you're eating, which is really hard to do. It's the thing. It's a lot easier to go to the grocery store.
It's expensive.
It's expensive.
Yeah, it is. I actually tried to do that when I was living in St. Louis. I looked at buying like a half cattle, and I guess I could have afforded it, but it was like, what's the trade-off here? It's just much cheaper to get factory farmed.
I mean, this might be a little tech hype beast, but people are hoping that, as internet improves with like Starlink from SpaceX, and just overall access to the internet improves and more remote work happens, and we just go full metaverse, it'll be easier to not live in a city, and so it'll be easier to space out, own more land, and people can go back to, smaller communities. Because part of the reason we need these giant supply chains for foods is because we all migrated to cities, right? To be like for economic activity. And if everyone's packed into the city, you're obviously not making your own food. And so if urban density decreases, it probably makes it easier for local food production, right? Like, it's easier for you to get local food in upstate New York than it is New York City. I guess it's just like an obvious point. So there might be this crazy thing where it's like technological progress forces us into cities, denser, worse for the earth. And then it's like we get the telecommunication technology that allows us to spread back out again. And then maybe we can be a little bit nicer to the mothership. That would be the optimistic case.
No, I think that's an interesting example of sort of like the natural trajectory of things with the underpinnings of technology allowing for a more sustainable solution. Like, no one's planning this from the top, but that seems reasonable enough to me. I have access to many farmers at relative affordability up here. I think I sent you guys those lads at Untapped Growth that are doing this cattle co-op thing. But I think this is a pretty fascinating idea. The idea is basically that there are a lot of large landowners in the U.S. of raw land. It's not productive. There's no resi. There's no commercial on it. It's just a lot of land in good open areas. And what these guys have done is they're approaching these landowners and they're saying, what about a situation where you had a rancher come onto your land, introduce a breed of ancestral rugged cattle to farm this land, and you give that rancher the ability to build equity in your land for regenerating the land. And you as a rancher, you're investing in an asset, which is basically a breed, a rugged breed, for which your return is the children of that breed, the cultivation and regeneration of your land, and meat, right? All stores of value that are hedges against inflation, uncorrelated with any currencies, right? And this is really good for everyone because farmers have been completely priced out of owning their land, right? They're being forced into thinner and thinner margins by industrial ag. They can't keep up. They can't pay off the mortgage, and that's because their expenses are inflating away. Actually, inflation is really the wrong word. Their expenses are running out of control based on the inflation of the dollar, and they can't build any equity in something. And so everyone is squeezed into a super short time preference for high yield short time preference. Pay your debtors, pay off your mortgages, bang on with your farm. But I think to your point, like if we invite a less dense existence, you can have little solutions like this that seem to kind of work for everyone. And you can take large swaths of land and you can regenerate them into way, way more productive and way more beautiful land for people. I think that kind of approach is pretty neat.
It's pretty crazy to think that, like, people don't like remote work because they feel like it's dehumanizing because they're just staring at a screen. But there is this kind of, if it gets good enough and it's extreme enough where you're literally just, you can work on your screen wherever you are, it can enable a more like native or like natural style to the rest of your life, right? Like right now you can't, I mean, unless you want to make that life choice, like most people aren't going to live with a lot of space, right? They're going to go cram themselves into a city. But now it's like, if we just go so extreme on the work side where it's like you literally are just staring at a screen, maybe you can get the other extreme of like living more like a farm life in your personal life, which is kind of, I don't know, this kind of trippy.
It's
how those
funny.
dualities work out together.
Pretty funny.
It's like you enter the metaverse so deep that you can also go back to being a farmer.
Unreal. Like you're posted like up in like a watchtower in the middle of your farm with like all your cattle roaming around. You're just on your laptop trading shitcoins.
Yeah. The metaverse farm barbell.
Bang.
Kind of crazy. No, I do think people that are like, anti-meat are just like kind of disturbed by the abstraction of the supply chain and its dehumanizing effects, which I think makes sense. But it makes sense why that bothers them, but it also doesn't mean, then there's like arguments for why you shouldn't eat meat, but it's like nutritionally the meat still makes sense.
Definitely.
It's like both things can be true. That the abstraction of supply chain is kind of grotesque, but also like you need these amino acids if you want to be healthy. So it's like,
do you guys see that the EU just signed off on mealworm as feed?
Oh yeah, yeah. I didn't look into.
I didn't know what that meant.
I saw you sent that.
I don't know what like. I hope it's feed for animals, but I mean I feel like we're going towards the point where that mealworm headline, it could be feed at like state-sponsored institutions like like mental asylums or hospitals or schools, God forbid, and all of that's in the name of energy efficiency and looking after the planet, when it's like humans aren't to eat worms.
Dude, I think it is for humans. I just looked it up. But yeah, it's real weird.
It's like Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer, they feed the people in the back of the train. It's like this train going around the earth has like the last contingent of humans on it, and like the wealthy live in the front of the train and the poor live in the back, and the poor get this feed of basically like cockroaches, and that's what they feed them, and the wealthy in the front are eating steaks. It's like, oh.
Yeah. Oh, I fact checked myself about the producer. It's James Cameron, for anybody listening. James Cameron was a producer of Game Changers, and he and his wife invested $140 million in Beyond Meat. Bang.
Damn. Oh, that's sketch, because Beyond Meat stock is not looking hot.
It's information warfare out here.
Shot in the ICO,
should we rally up the
I
Wall
think,
Street?
so.
Should we rally up the Wall Street bets, boys, and short this Beyond Meat into oblivion?
Yeah.
We'll get Cargill in here. We'll get Joe Rogan in here.
Chamath. Fucking Chamath.
Chamath.
The crazy thing about that is he probably wasn't like, oh, I'm going to invest in this thing and put out misinformation. He probably was like, I'm investing in this thing, and like people need to know that like what the truth is, Like he probably wasn't being nefarious. He probably thought he was helping everyone, but
it's a really good point, actually.
Doesn't mean. I mean, that's the
Like
thing about biases. Like, from the outside, your bias is wrong or like evil, but on the inside, you think you're doing what's right. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
That's a really good point.
we're also, at least I'm not. I think I'm the most violent arguer probably, and least forgiving. But like the vegan camp is just trying to do the best they can. Like, they're under the impression that they're doing things that are healthy for the environment. They're under the impression that they're moving progress forward. And the point is not to villainize, just to inform.
Right. Yeah, they're doing the best they can, but
Do better.
um, as long as they don't stop me from eating meats, then we're all good.
Yeah. Cool. Should we wrap her up?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for everyone who stuck through this episode with us. And I hope you learned something. And go ahead tonight, eat a steak, see how you feel. Let us know.
I mean, I think the TLDR is, there's a lot of nutritional benefits to meat. It's definitely good for you, and there are some aspects of the meat production food chain that is, really bad, and we could aim to make it better and, eat more locally. But, it's not
Yeah, it's a
black and
great
white.
point.
I guess the black and white point is that the red meat has all the essential amino acids. So if you want to be strong and healthy, you need those amino acids.
No,
That's black and white.
It's not black and white. It's marbled.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, right? Like, I think, at least me personally, like, I come off as like a red meat shill, and I'm just like, oh, like, look at this guy, dude. He needs to eat more red meat or whatever. But it's not that simple, right? It's like, what are your values? And yeah, definitely eating locally is, that's the best in our opinion. So cool. Well, we'll see everybody on the next one. Peace.
Peace, guys.